Hey guys, my name's Frank, and this is my workshop. Hey guys, Frank here. I had a number of requests for a shop tour. I named my channel Wood and Metal Shop partly because of my experience in high school taking wood and metal shop with Mr. Welter. Anyway, he was the wrestling coach at our high school. I was kind of a nerd. I did okay in the class. One day I'll tell you about some of my projects in that class and some of our mishaps, but it was fun and I learned a lot, and I guess I have Mr. Welter to thank for that. Anyway, most of my life I've been a woodworker, an avid woodworker. I've built a lot of furniture. I'll add some photos of some of my furniture that I've built, grandfather clocks, chests of drawers, desks, that sort of thing. So you can see the kind of stuff I've been building over the years. And in the past 5 years, I've been more and more interested in metalworking. Part of it's because I've run out of space in the house for furniture. I've given my kids furniture, my sister, my brother. There's just no more room for furniture. And so my interest in Cub Cadets, and I do have quite a Cub Cadet collection. You notice in some of my other videos, there's a lot of Cub Cadet content here on my channel. I am a collector, and I restore Cub Cadets. I think I've got a dozen running and fully restored Cub Cadets from the 60s, 1960s and 70s, vintage International Harvester Cub Cadets. So, having run out of room for furniture, while I still do home repairs and I have redone bathrooms and kitchens and other projects around the house, this house and other houses, my interest in Cub Cadets has kind of gotten me back into mechanical stuff, and needing pieces, parts, repair parts, or modifications to the Cub Cadets has got me first buying a welder, and then metal saws, eventually a lathe, and then another lathe, and a mill, and a shaper, and a number of other tools useful for metalworking. So I thought I would take a few minutes and walk through the shop and give you an idea of what I've got here and some of my comments on, did they meet my expectations, the tools meet my expectations, what I think about them, what would I suggest, somebody else in my position, doing as far as building a workshop or buying tools for a workshop. All right, if you're a woodworker, we'll do the woodworking stuff first. We'll walk through that, and then we'll get into the metalworking equipments. And there are some tools which serve both purposes, and we'll save them for the end of the wood and have that as a segue into the metalworking machines. All right, so the first tool you need as a woodworker is a table saw. And this is my Rockwell unisaw, 10-inch unisaw, 3 horsepower, single phase, that I bought secondhand, replaced the bearings in it, then the belts, and it's been a great saw. I've had this saw for 20 years now. I used to have an old Craftsman table saw. You can do good work with Craftsman tools. I did for many years, but having a solid cabinet saw with a 3 horsepower, a true 3 horsepower motor is a game changer for woodworking. I've got my router on a router lift mounted in the extension of the table saw. So having a table saw and a router table, or as I've got it here, lift in the table saw extension, 2 key first things that you need as a woodworker. Probably the next tool as a woodworker you would want to buy is a joiner. And here I've got a Delta 6-inch joiner. I mean, it's the minimum size you would want for general woodworking. I have been thinking about upgrading to an 8 or 10-inch joiner. 10-inch joiner would take a lot of floor space. With my reduction in the amount of woodworking I do these days, this still suffices just fine. So a joiner would be the second tool that I would purchase as a woodworker. The next tool I think that's important, and it's not very expensive, is a compound miter saw. Cutting lumber to length, mitering pieces of lumber, this is an indispensable tool. And sliding compound miter saws like this have largely replaced the radial arm saw. I had a radial arm saw for many years. I got rid of it. You can't even sell them these days. I actually took mine to the local landfill transfer station and set it in the free pile. I don't know if anybody picked it up, but it was a nice Craftsman radial arm saw, but they don't really have much use anymore. They do have their advocates, but I'm not one of them. Sliding compound miter saw, this is a 12-inch, works great for cutting lumber down to size. All right, the next tool is a drill press. You need a drill press for drilling holes that are perpendicular to the lumber surface. It helps to have a drill press in order to handle larger bits such as Forstner bits, which you really can't use in a handheld drill. So drill presses, this is a floor standing drill press. It just happens to have a tool cart underneath it to hold the drill pits and that sort of thing. So having a drill press is important. All right, the next tool I would suggest you purchase is a bandsaw. This is a Delta 14-inch bandsaw. It's a good all-around bandsaw for scroll work, small cutting, ripping. It's a very safe saw to operate. It doesn't have the risks of kickback, for example, that a table saw might have. So it's a much safer saw to use in that regard, though it does have the blade, so you got to be obviously careful where you put your fingers, as you would with any saw. But bandsaw is helpful. The bandsaw is the main tool for cutting curves and curved parts. If you're going to make cabriole legs, or if you're going to bandsaw arches and that sort of thing, this is the tool to use for that. All right. So the woodworking lathe is the next tool that you should add to your workshop. There are bowl turners that almost exclusively use a lathe. They use a lathe and a bandsaw to do almost all of their woodworking. They would want a bigger lathe than this. This doesn't have the weight, the mass, and the power that a bowl turner might need. But for general workshop use, this is perfect. It's variable speed, adjustable, so you don't have to change belts on it. The headstock turns around for outboard turning, and it's got a bed long enough to turn most anything you would want to turn on a lathe. And I use it for spindles for chairs or for grandfather clock, that sort of thing. All right, here's the next thing I think you ought to consider, and this is a dust collector. Now I've had this one for, I don't know, 25 years probably. It was the first tool I ever bought from Grizzly. It's a Taiwanese made unit. I did upgrade. It originally came with a cloth bag on top. I did upgrade it with a pleated filter. And it's 2 horsepower. It's connected to the duct system here in the shop. And even though it's not a cyclone dust collector, it does fine. I have no issues whatsoever. I have blast gates on each tool, and so as I go around from tool to tool, I can open a blast gate, and the suction this machine creates is entirely adequate for my needs. Though I've been tempted to upgrade to a Cyclone, I just can't justify it. This one works great. All right, speaking of dust collection, there's one more thing. And if you are concerned about your health, and every woodworker should be concerned about breathing dust, wood dust, and especially in some toxic species, it can be problematic. I have an air collector, an air filter here in the ceiling, which is remote controlled, and it's a HEPA filter. And this is a JDS unit. It collects, it has a pre-filter, and it filters the air. It'll take smoke out of the air in the workshop, and has a timer on it so you can run it for 2 or 3 hours after you leave the shop, and does a great job. Filters last quite a long time. I think I've only changed in 20 years. I've changed the filter, I don't know, 2 or 3 times, maybe every 5 years. So that will save your lungs from a lot of sawdust. Okay, as you get further into woodworking, things like cutting your own lumber, buying lumber thicker, and recutting it to thinner dimension in a process called resawing. You might want to look at a larger bandsaw. Now, this particular bandsaw is a Hitachi B600 resaw, and it's actually a bandsaw whose primary purpose is to cut lumber into thinner boards, thick lumber into thinner boards. So if the board's 2 inches thick, you can cut it into 2 boards 1 inch thick. It's got a 3-inch wide blade. The teeth have carbide tips, and this is a 3 horsepower machine, so you can cut up to 12 inches thick, a board up to 12 inches wide, or cut 12 inches thick, and make lumber. So as you get more involved into furniture making, having lumber specific thicknesses, or in the case of making your own veneers, a saw like this would allow you to cut an especially nice, well-figured piece of lumber into multiple thin pieces, say 3/16 or of an 1/8 of an inch thick, to use as veneer. And a combination of that plus a belt sander, a drum sander, would get you figured veneers that you've made yourself. And there are applications for that type of work. Another tool that you'll want as a serious woodworker is a planer. This is a Grizzly 20-inch 5 horsepower planer. There are several brands that look very similar to this. This is probably a knockoff of the Powermatic planer, which has very similar appearance. It was made by Powermatic originally. This one I purchased from Grizzly. I've had it 15 years, maybe 20 years. It works great. I did add having problems with the rollers in the feed table, not feeding lumber adequately. I did install this polyethylene sheet fastened to a piece of plywood, which makes a very slick surface for feeding lumber through. So once I did that, I've had 0 issues with lumber hanging up going through the planer. Makes a big difference. On top of the planer, I have a drum sander. This is a Performax 16-inch drum sander, and it's on top of the planer to save floor space. I just stacked them, and it's great for surfacing veneers. It doesn't have the power to really do a lot of thicknessing. You won't be thicknessing lumber on here, more sanding, and maybe thicknessing very small strips. When I did some caulk beading on several pieces of furniture, I used this to finish the strips of lumber cherry to 1/8 of an inch thick for that application. All right, one of my early purchases as a woodworker was this Woodmaster planer molder. This type of machine was made famous by Bell Saw. They made a planer molder. This one right now is a 12-inch planer. It's 5 horsepower, but it's also a molding machine. You can install molding heads, molding cutters in the head, and this right now is set up for molding. I think what's in there now is probably a crown mold cutter. So this machine is great for making picture frame moldings, crown molding, all that sort of thing. And it will mold lumber up to 12 inches wide. And I've used it a number of times. A kitchen I redid a couple of years ago, oh, now it's been 15 years ago probably, was all cherry trim. And I ran probably 200 feet of 4-inch wide cherry through this to make a large crown mold. It was actually a 3-piece crown molding. So great machine for making your own moldings. All right, so let's go back over here. One of the last woodworking machines is a shaper. Now this is a Delta 3 horsepower shaper. Shaper is like a giant router table, and because it holds much larger cutters, it can cut raised panels or joints or any kind of molding that you would like to make. Being 3 horsepower, it can handle larger cutters, larger cuts. Now shapers have a reputation of being more dangerous than some of the other machines you might have in the shop, but they're no different than a router table in that regard. So with proper tooling and proper safety practices, they're no more dangerous than any other tool in the workshop. And for this one, I do have a power feed, which adds to safety in feeding strips through the shaper. All right, so that completes the walkthrough of the major woodworking machines here in the shop. Let's switch phases a little bit and look at some metalworking tools. Now there is one tool that we'll look at which crosses the boundaries between wood and metalworking, and that's a sander, a stationary sanding machine. So this is my disc belt sander. This particular one is Jet brand. It has a 6 by 48 inch belt and a 12-inch disc. And having a sander like this is helpful in woodworking, but to be honest, right now I use it more for metalworking. And this is kind of the tool which is used in both realms. One of the first tools I ever bought that you would classify as metalworking is a grinder. And here on this workbench, I've got 3 grinders. I've got a small kind of general purpose grinder with coarse and fine aluminum oxide wheels, so that I would use this for general grinding, sharpening lawnmower blades, that sort of thing. The other 2 grinders are a little more specialized. This is a variable speed grinder. It has a diamond wheel used for sharpening carbide cutting bits, and then it's got a green carbide wheel also for high-speed steel or carbide. The middle grinder is a slow-speed 8-inch grinder, which is used for sharpening steel cutter bits, chisels, plane blades, that sort of thing. So a grinder of some sort is an essential addition to the shop. When you get into metalworking, you'll be welding or cutting. Now I've had this oxyacetylene torch set for a number of years. refill the tanks at the local welding supply shop, having a cutting torch. Sometimes there's no way to get pieces apart. You got to cut them apart. For welding, this is a Hobart MIG welder, uses MIG gas. This is my go-to welder, use it for almost all of my fabrication. Now it is a 110 volt welder, so it is limited to welding about 1/4 inch material. I do have a stick welder, a 240 amp stick welder, a Craftsman stick welder that I've had for 40 years. Was my first welder. If I need to weld anything bigger than this will handle, then I break out the big stick welder. I do have a plasma cutter here. That's a relatively recent addition. There's another rigid shop vac. Here's another rigid shop vac, and here's a larger rigid shop vac. So that's what, 3 of the small ones and 1 of the larger ones. I tell you, if you're going to buy a shop vac, the rigid shop vacs are the best ones. I've had Craftsman. The old Craftsman were decent. The new ones and anything you can buy at Lowe's shop vac brand is not that great, in my opinion. All right, metalworking tools. Let's look at 3 metalworking tools over here in this end of the shop. So this is a 9-inch Logan back-geared thread cutting lathe. This is vintage. This is probably from 1940s. It's a great little lathe. It has reduction belt set up here, belt drive with a 1/2 horse motor. This lathe is in pristine condition. The ways are nearly perfect. There's almost no backlash in the saddle, in the cross slide. This is a great little lathe. I suspect that a hobbyist has used this. I purchased it about 5 years ago. Bought some tooling for it. It came with a couple of chucks. I don't use it for threading much because in order to do any threading, you have to swap all these gears around. It did come with a complete set of gears for doing that, and I have done some with that, but it takes some time to change it around in order to do that. So 9-inch Logan lathe. I leave this one with the 4-jaw chuck on it because I've got a 3-jaw chuck on this South Bend 10-inch lathe. Now the advantage of this lathe over the Logan is it has quick change gears for changing the feed rate for cutting different size threads, so you don't have to change the gears in the headstock. This particular lathe is 10-inch. It's seen quite a bit of wear over the years. There is a good bit of backlash in the cross slide, but backlash is not necessarily a problem if you know how to handle it. You just need to take that into account as you're making your cuts, and to take the backlash out before you start a cut. This particular lathe, I believe, was a U.S. Navy shipyard lathe. It has an anchor stamp in it here, and this is a 1942 vintage South Bend lathe. And it came in good shape. I mean, it's got the stand, the original stand with it. It's been repainted partially, but it runs nice. It is a 3-phase, so I have a VFD controller hooked up to it to run the 3-phase motor. It's 2 horsepower, 3-phase motor, and it's a nice machine. All right, the next machine that I think would be important for a metal worker after a lathe is a mill. This is a vertical mill, or sometimes called a knee mill. People use the term Bridgeport mill, which is this is what this is patterned after, is the Bridgeport mill. This is a Taiwanese mill. It was used as a spare in a machine shop, so it got very little use. It is in excellent, excellent condition. And this one has a 2 horsepower motor, and because it's 3-phase, it does have a VFD, variable frequency controller on it, and a DRO, XY axis DRO, and then I've installed my own Quill DRO on it. So I can have all 3 axes have digital readouts on them. So a knee mill, it does have, and it has power feed for the X-axis and power feed, which I've added for the Y-axis. So obviously a mill like this is, not only does it make a great drill press, I use it all the time for fabricating parts for my various projects. One of the latest ones being my mini motor grader here. If you haven't seen the video on the motor grader, you ought to look at that project I built last year. Okay, the last metalworking machine that I've purchased, and there are more. My shop is by no means complete as far as metalworking, is this little South Bend 7-inch shaper. Shapers are largely archaic in the sense that they've been replaced by the milling machine, and you won't find much use for shapers in the modern machine shop anymore. Pretty much anything a shaper can do, a milling machine can do faster, but they are pretty neat machines. The reason I got this one is because this goes back to my story about Mr. Welter, Coach Welter, who was my shop teacher in freshman year high school, wood and metal shop. We had a shaper in the shop, though we never got to use it. So I don't know why none of the projects in metal shop used the shaper. We didn't have a milling machine. We had a ate, and most of the work we did was on the lathe or was handwork. So it was either metal lathe or shaper. We had or drill press. Don't think there were any other metalworking machines in the shop. Maybe a grinder. So anyway, the shaper is a cool little machine. Seeing ABOM79, who has a fabulous YouTube channel, has several large shapers, industrial shapers, and when I saw his, it took me back to high school and the little shaper that we had there in high school, which I believe was similar to this one. I'm not sure if it was the exact one or not, but very similar. And at that point, it started my mind going about getting a shaper. So I do have a little video clip on my channel with the shaper running, so if you want to know how a shaper works or what it does, you can look at that clip as well. All right, so the last, I guess you can call it a tool, is this sandblast cap. It works okay, but I don't use it much because my air system is really not up to the task. I have a 3 horsepower air compressor. It just doesn't have the capacity to really operate this as it should be operated. So it gets used occasionally for small parts, but as you can see, for the most part, it's just gathering dust in here. I don't know that I would, if you had anything big you needed to be done, you would take it out to some professional shop to have something done. If you have small parts, this would work okay if there's some reason you need it for a lot of small parts. In the stuff I do, I don't find it particularly useful. All right, I hope you found that walkthrough of the tools in the shop interesting. I'll give you a view here of the entire shop, give you an idea of the layout. It is 28 by 46. At this end, I've got lumber storage, mostly cherry and walnut, either up on the wall or stacked here on the floor. I probably have 1,000 board feet of cherry and walnut lumber. This is all rough cut that I purchased years ago. Most of it is 10 to 15 years old and was dried, air dried in my barn and then brought inside here. So over in the corner is a air conditioning system. This shop has a 1.5 ton heat pump with 8 kilowatt strip heaters, and the ductwork across the back wall there provides heating and cooling year-round for the shop. The shop is super insulated. The studs are all 2x6s, and the ceiling has over a foot of insulation. I think it's R40 something, R38 plus. So obviously I have a parts washer, I have Cub Cadet parts here on the ground, toolboxes, workbench along the back wall, goes the full length with cabinets, several woodworking benches here, obviously outfeed for the table saw is useful, pair of workbenches here back to back, a vintage carpenter's tool chest, which is actually pretty interesting. I found this in an antique shop. Somebody made this. It has a lot of drawers, number of drawers. I don't have a whole lot in it right now, but it is a very interesting toolbox. LFC or LFG initials in the top. Anyway, pretty cool. Another workbench. This tends to be my metalworking workbench. Storage drawers underneath. Of course, a storage cabinet over here made out of curly maple. This lathe is on a storage cabinet. Got this old, looks like Navy surplus. I don't know where it came from. Storage cabinet, drawers full of hardware and parts, several wall cabinets, toolbox over here with hand tools, and of course along the workbench here, toolbox after toolbox. Here the machinist toolbox is for all the machine tooling, and another toolbox for machine tools. So, all right, guys, I hope you enjoyed the walkthrough of the Wood and Metal Shop Time workshop. That's all for now. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.